Welcome to our channel, where the most chilling horror stories come to life. Today, I have an especially haunting tale for you, a horrifying tragedy that took place in the small town of Frederica, Delaware. A woman was murdered and hung up like a Halloween decoration right outside her home. At first, everyone thought it was just part of the festivities, but the truth behind it is far more terrifying. This story isn't just about death, but about a sinister darkness that haunts the entire town, stretching from the past to the present. So, what really happened on that fateful Halloween night? Join me as we step into the darkness and uncover the chilling mystery behind these gruesome deaths. Frederica, Delaware, is a quiet little town resting on the edge of the modern world. Surrounded by lush green hills and dotted with vintage houses, everything here feels timeless, safe, and untouched. The people care for each other, preserve traditional values, and Halloween is an event they look forward to all year. The town has made Halloween an inseparable part of its culture. When October arrives, each house competes to decorate, twinkling jack-o'-lanterns, grinning scarecrows, fake cobwebs strung across tree branches. For Frederica's residents, Halloween isn't just a night for kids to trick or treat, it's a time for the whole town to wear a spooky guise. Everything is welcomed, as long as it's scary enough to bring some laughs and a little thrill. Lily Davenport never thought she'd end up in a place like Frederica. She moved here a few months ago, and she's more of an introvert, not someone who easily blends in. After leaving her job in the city, she chose this place for its tranquility. The small house she bought sits on the edge of town, a bit secluded but close enough to the center so she doesn't feel completely isolated. Lily likes the quiet, the privacy, but there was one thing she didn't expect. Halloween in Frederica was something no one could avoid, even if they didn't want to participate. From mid-October, the town began to transform into something eerie. Laughter echoed, kids ran about, while Lily buried herself in her work, trying to ignore everything happening around her. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, something didn't feel right. One weekend evening, as Lily was walking home after a long day, she felt someone watching her. The streetlights flickered, the trees whispered in the autumn breeze, and somewhere in the shadows behind her, something moved. She turned around, but there was nothing there except for Halloween decorations, with spooky figures hanging from the porches of nearby houses. "Must be my imagination," she muttered to herself, trying to push away the uncomfortable feeling. She quickened her pace, feeling the chill of the wind on her neck as if someone was watching her from somewhere far away but very close. Once she got home, Lily locked the door and made herself a cup of tea. She sat down on the couch, staring out the window. Darkness was falling, and the houses around the town began to light up with the glow of jack-o'-lanterns. Everyone was ready for Halloween, but Lily wasn't. She had no interest in decorating or dressing up. Halloween was just a reminder that she was an outsider, not like the townsfolk who had spent their whole lives here in Frederica. But something was off tonight. Lily could feel it in every breath, a sense that something wasn't right. The laughter and cheer of the townsfolk seemed a bit forced, as if this town was hiding a dark secret beneath the veil of holiday joy. She stood up, walked over to the window, and pulled the curtain shut. But as her hand touched the fabric, a soft sound echoed from the garden. Lily froze. It wasn't the wind or a nocturnal animal. It was footsteps. Lily stood still, listening, but there was nothing more. She told herself she'd misheard, probably just a stray cat or a neighbor passing by. But she couldn't shake the feeling, that feeling of being watched. A few days later, the town began to decorate even more intensely. Houses along the main road were covered with fake cobwebs, and ghostly figures swung from the trees, looking like spirits floating in the breeze. Lily, not wanting to get swept into the festive mood, kept to herself and avoided people. But on the night before Halloween, just as she was about to go to bed, she heard a noise outside her door, a soft scratching sound, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. She stepped closer to the door, her heart pounding. The darkness outside was like a thick veil, hiding everything. Lily took a deep breath, cracked the door open, but saw no one. Everything was silent, except for a creepy figure dangling from the neighbor's tree. The dim light cast an eerie glow on it, and for a moment, Lily felt like it was staring straight at her. She quickly closed and locked the door, her sense of unease growing stronger. Something was wrong. That night, Lily didn't know it would be the last time she'd feel any sense of calm in her own home. Tomorrow was Halloween, and Frederica would never be peaceful again. Lily Davenport opened her eyes in the thick darkness. The clock by her bed read 2:27 a.m. The night was still pitch black, and her small house lay quietly at the edge of Frederica. But the calm was gone. A dreadful presence crept through every crack and wall, like an invisible entity watching her every breath. A chill ran down her spine. She sat up in bed, feeling the heavy silence around her. No wind howled, no insects buzzed, just a dead silence. Then, the sound returned. Knock, knock, knock. Lily froze. The knocking came from the front door, steady and chilling, as if someone were standing outside, waiting. The rhythm was gentle but relentless, like an invitation to step outside, or a reminder that she wasn't really alone. She held her breath, heart pounding. "Who's out there?" she whispered into the darkness. There was no reply, but the knocking stopped. Lily decided to go check. She wasn't one to scare easily, and the disturbance annoyed her more than it frightened her. In her mind, she reasoned that it was probably just some kids messing around, trying to spook the new stranger in town. She walked over to the door, turned on the hallway light, and flung the door open. Outside, the darkness was thick, but the porch light was enough to illuminate her front yard, and there was no one there. Lily scanned the area, but saw no signs of anyone or anything. Just a few dry leaves skittering across the ground. "Guess I imagined it," Lily murmured, closing and locking the door. But as she turned away, a stronger chill swept over her. The sensation of someone standing right behind her, watching her with an unblinking gaze she couldn't shake. The next morning, Lily went to work as usual, trying to push aside the strange feelings from the night before. She convinced herself that maybe she was just stressed from the new job and the sudden changes in her life. But something was off, and she knew it, as she passed by the other houses. All were decorated eerily, ghoulish scarecrows, fake cobwebs, skulls, even hands poking out from the ground as if the dead were rising. Lily felt a shiver as she walked by the house across the street. It was overdone compared to the other houses. With hanging dummies and dim, flickering lights, they looked so real. She had to turn away to avoid staring too long. Halloween night arrived, and Frederica was steeped in a hauntingly festive spirit. Children laughed and ran around. Halloween music echoed from the houses, creating a mix of cheer and eeriness. But Lily decided to stay home, skipping the town's party. She didn't want to face the fake scary decorations. They only reminded her of last night's nightmare. Close to midnight, as the street outside grew quieter, Lily heard soft giggles coming from outside her living room window. She stepped closer to look out. In the faint streetlight, she saw dummies swaying in the wind, hanging from the trees, like silhouettes of souls in nooses. But one figure made her blood run cold. It hung from the tree in her neighbor's yard, a dark, heavy shape swaying in the breeze. Lily squinted, realizing it wasn't like the other decorations. Instead of fabric or plastic, this one looked heavier, more solid. Her legs froze as she looked closer. It was a real person, a woman's figure, head drooping, and she recognized it was her own. Lily stumbled back, heart racing, desperately trying to deny what she'd just seen. It couldn't be. She couldn't be seeing herself hanging out there. But when she closed her eyes and opened them again, the horrifying image was still there, silent and motionless, like a grim warning. And then, as if from a nightmare, she felt an icy hand rest on her shoulder. "It's time, Lily," a voice rasped, hoarse and cold, like it came from the deepest shadows. She whipped around, but the room was empty. No one was there. Darkness enveloped her, and in that moment, Lily knew there was no way out. Halloween night had become her final nightmare. The next morning, the town of Frederica woke up to a creeping fear that lingered in every corner. It should have been a joyful Halloween day, but the atmosphere felt heavy and unusually dark. Before the sun had fully risen, Mrs. Dorothy, the elderly neighbor, got up and went outside to fetch the newspaper like she did every day. She loved the crisp autumn air, taking a deep breath before heading back inside. But something at the house across the street made her stop. In front of Lily's house, hanging from a large tree branch, was a figure that looked disturbingly real. It was shaped like a woman, with hair hanging down and arms limp at her sides. The clothes on the figure seemed oddly familiar. They were the same clothes Lily had been wearing the last time Mrs. Dorothy saw her the night before. Mrs. Dorothy frowned and stepped closer. At first, she thought it was just part of a Halloween prank, some decoration Lily might have put up to join the festive spirit. But the closer she got, the more something felt wrong. A foul smell hit her nose. Not the scent of plastic or the usual fake Halloween figures, but the stench of death. Mrs. Dorothy gasped and staggered back. Her eyes widened. Her heart raced as she realized it wasn't a decoration. It was a real body. Her scream echoed down the street. In no time, neighbors gathered outside, shocked to see Mrs. Dorothy collapse on the ground in front of Lily's house. Her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. The police were called immediately. Lily's house was quickly cordoned off, and her body was gently lowered from the tree, as though she were still alive. But Lily's face was pale, her eyes staring blankly, and her mouth slightly open, as if she had tried to scream something before death took her. The townspeople stood around the scene, whispering in fear. No one could believe what they were seeing. How could something so horrible happen in such a peaceful town? No one wanted to believe that someone could be so cruel as to kill a person and hang them up like a twisted decoration. The children who had played nearby the night before, laughing and talking next to Lily's body without realizing, now shivered, their eyes filled with terror. Some people bowed their heads. Others muttered prayers. The shadow of death loomed over Frederica, turning everything dark and frightening. Detective Richard Greene was in charge of the investigation. He had lived and worked in Frederica for over 30 years, handling many cases, but none as disturbing as this. Greene looked at Lily's body, his expression grave, trying to piece together what had happened. "You think it's a murder designed to scare people?" the young officer beside him whispered. "Maybe someone from out of town, trying to turn Frederica into a nightmare on Halloween night." Greene nodded, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He had seen many killers, but none who would be so cruel as to turn their victim into a sickening prank. As the crime scene was investigated, the police found no trace of the murderer. No footprints, no fingerprints. Lily's house showed no signs of forced entry. Everything was intact, as if her death was just another part of the Halloween festivities. But this festival had turned into a true nightmare. By the time afternoon came, the townspeople began closing their doors earlier than usual. Houses that had once been decorated with bright colors and spooky displays were now stripped of their ghouls and Halloween decorations. No one felt like celebrating Halloween anymore. Lily's death had shattered the festive spirit, replacing it with a deep, unsettling fear. Mrs. Dorothy couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lily's pale face hanging from the tree, her lifeless eyes searching for answers. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, trying to convince herself that everything would pass. But she knew that from now on, Frederica would never be the same. Halloween night had stolen a part of the town's soul, and something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance. Detective Richard Greene sat in his dimly lit office, the weak light from the desk lamp casting shadows over the cold, lifeless words on the files about Lily's death. He had gone over every detail, from the collected evidence to the vague statements from the townspeople. But the case remained a tangled mess, no leads, no clear clues to explain who could have caused this horrific event. The dead don't lie, he thought to himself, but he knew that some stories lived on in Frederica, especially around Halloween. The town's dark history wasn't just rumor. Greene started digging through the old archives of the police station and discovered that Frederica had been the site of several strange cases back in the 1970s. There had been murders with no clear cause, where victims had also been hung up like grotesque decorations. Back then, no one had caught the killer. Every trace vanished with the dawn, and those deaths quietly became part of the town's unsolved, dark mysteries. Greene devoured the old reports, finding that the cases shared one strange detail: all the victims were new to town. Just like Lily, the townspeople had whispered about an unknown killer, someone intent on preserving the traditions of Frederica by getting rid of outsiders. Greene wondered if Lily's death was part of that same dark tradition. The interrogations of the neighbors began. Greene interviewed them one by one, asking if they had seen or heard anything unusual on Halloween night. But every story was disjointed, each person offering a different version. No one admitted to seeing or hearing anything suspicious. They all claimed to know little about Lily and said they didn't pay attention to her house. But when Greene spoke to Mrs. Dorothy, the woman who first found Lily's body, he noticed something in her eyes that made him pause. Mrs. Dorothy trembled when she mentioned Lily, her gaze darting nervously, her frail hands clasping tightly together. "Mrs. Dorothy," Greene said sternly, "did you see anyone lingering around Lily's house?" She shook her head, but her trembling lips didn't match her words. "No, no one, it's just, I think," she hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if afraid someone might hear. "I think someone was watching, from the shadows." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Dorothy didn't answer, her gaze distant, as though she was remembering something terrifying. Greene found it odd but didn't press further. He knew that the older residents of the town often believed in supernatural forces, and he couldn't dismiss the possibility that something beyond reason was involved. Greene left Mrs. Dorothy's house, his mind swirling with questions and no answers. As dusk began to fall, the chill and silence of the night settled over the town. When he returned to the police station, Greene was informed that someone had seen Tom Harris, the man living next to Lily, standing at his window on Halloween night, staring intently at her house. Greene immediately decided to confront Tom Harris. Tom Harris was a thin, quiet, and somewhat eccentric man. He lived alone in an old house and rarely interacted with anyone. As Greene stepped into Tom's home, the smell of mildew hit him. The place was filled with old paintings and black and white photographs of the town from many years ago. "Tom," Greene began, his eyes locking onto Tom's cold, expressionless face. "Someone reported seeing you standing by your window on Halloween night, watching Lily's house. What were you doing?" Tom stared back at Greene, his eyes deep and empty like the night outside. "I was just observing," Tom replied, his voice flat and mechanical. "She was a stranger. I don't trust strangers." A chill ran down Greene's spine from the emotionless tone of Tom's voice. "Do you know anything about Lily's death?" Tom smirked, a cold and unsettling smile creeping across his lips. "You know, Halloween is a time when people like to play with fear. Isn't that right?" Greene sensed a deep unease in Tom's voice. He suspected that Tom knew more than he was letting on, but there was no solid evidence to pin anything on him. All Greene had was a strange man with a creepy smile and cryptic words. "Are you afraid of the dark, Detective Greene?" Tom asked, his eyes wide, as if peering into Greene's soul. "The dark is where secrets are kept. Who's to say the dark isn't a living thing, watching us?" Greene left Tom's house, feeling a growing sense of dread. He didn't have enough evidence to charge Tom, but his instincts told him this man was involved in Lily's death. There was something in the way Tom spoke about the darkness, as if he knew that something sinister lurked within it. The case had grown more tangled and mysterious than ever. The people of Frederica were living in fear, and every night, the darkness seemed to deepen, bringing with it the cold of death and secrets yet to be uncovered. Greene stood in the center of the town, looking into the shadows that surrounded him, feeling as if 1,000 unseen eyes were watching his every move. The killer was still out there. Halloween had passed, but the darkness remained, and Greene knew that if he didn't solve the case soon, the shadows would return, claiming another soul for death's embrace. Detective Richard Greene drove down the pitch-black road leading out of town, his mind racing with unanswered questions. His conversation with Tom Harris the previous day haunted him. There was something in Tom's voice, in that cold stare, that Greene couldn't shake, the feeling that Tom knew more than he was letting on. Halloween had passed, but the fear still clung to Frederica, as if the darkness from that night had never left. Every evening, windows remained shut tight, houses cloaked in darkness, and the townspeople avoided the streetlights, too afraid to venture outside after sundown. The urgent phone call early that morning startled Greene. He picked up, and the panicked voice of the young officer on the other end blurted out, "Detective Greene, you need to come right away. We found another body." Greene rushed out the door, his heart pounding. Halloween was over, but the darkness lingered. When he arrived at the scene, a horrifying sight awaited him, a woman hanging from a tree branch outside her own house. Her body limp, eyes wide open and empty, devoid of life. This time, it wasn't Lily. The new victim was Mrs. Dorothy. Greene stood before Mrs. Dorothy's body, a cold chill running down his spine. She had been the first to discover Lily, the one who had spoken about shadows in the night. And now, she had become a victim herself. This can't be a coincidence, Greene muttered. Both Lily and Mrs. Dorothy were connected to the case. And now both were dead. Killed in the same way, hung like part of a deadly prank. All signs pointed back to Tom Harris. Greene didn't need any more reminders. He drove straight to Tom's house, gripping the steering wheel tightly. This would be the final confrontation with the man Greene believed had brought this horror to his town. When he arrived, Tom's house was engulfed in thick darkness. Greene knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He broke the door down, gun drawn, scanning the room filled with black and white photos of the town from decades ago. The room was cold and eerie, and in the center stood a wooden chair, as if waiting for someone to sit in it. The walls were covered in old pictures of Frederica, but among them were photos of the previous victims, the ones who had disappeared without a trace on Halloween in years past. Greene stepped closer, his eyes stopping at the last two photos, Lily's and then Mrs. Dorothy's. Both pictures were neatly hung, and next to them was an empty space, as if awaiting one more. The next photo was of himself. Greene's heart raced, and his blood ran cold. Someone had been watching him. They were ready to complete the collection. From the shadows, Greene heard a faint, chilling laugh. He spun around, flashlight beaming into the darkness. There stood Tom Harris, his deep eyes like black voids, and a cold smile spread across his face. "You've come, Detective Greene. I knew you would," Tom whispered, his voice soft but filled with a strange power, as if the darkness itself were speaking through him. "It's you," Greene rasped. "You killed Lily. You killed Mrs. Dorothy, and all those others before them. You're the one behind these murders." Tom chuckled, a haunting sound that echoed through the dark room. "You don't understand, Detective. I'm not just a murderer. I am the embodiment of the darkness." The shadows around Tom seemed to expand, enveloping his body, forming a faint shape. Greene tightened his grip on his gun, but his hand shook as the darkness slowly consumed every corner of the house. "Frederica chose me long ago," Tom whispered, his voice blending with the howling wind. "I am part of this tradition. Every Halloween, I claim a new soul to keep the darkness alive. And now, you will be next." Greene didn't wait. He fired his gun, but no sound echoed back. When the light flashed, the room was empty. Tom had vanished like smoke, leaving Greene alone in the crushing darkness. He spun around, trying to find his way out, but the front door had disappeared. The darkness had been waiting for him. The next morning, the townspeople discovered Detective Richard Greene's body. He was hanging from a tree branch outside Tom Harris' house, his eyes wide and empty, as if searching for answers he would never find. The rumors about the case spread throughout the town, and no one dared to speak Tom Harris' name again. From that day on, Frederica lived in perpetual fear. Every Halloween, doors were locked tight, and no one dared venture outside after nightfall. Children no longer trick-or-treated, and Tom Harris' house remained in darkness, a grim reminder of the price the town had paid for its buried secrets. And every year, on Halloween night, a shadowy figure would appear, standing silently beneath the tree where innocent souls had been hung. Frederica would never escape the darkness that had claimed it. And that's the horrifying tale of the town of Frederica, where every Halloween, darkness returns, bringing with it fear and death. Is Tom Harris just an ordinary murderer? Or is he truly the embodiment of something far darker that engulfs the entire town? These mysteries may never be fully solved, but one thing is certain: every Halloween, the darkness continues to hunt for new souls. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you enjoyed chilling tales like this, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next terrifying story. Have a safe Halloween, but remember, never take the darkness lightly.